Women thought he was beautiful, men thought he was cool. So why was Calvin Lockhart's career destroyed, and did he destroy it himself? This is Ashley with Ashley Says So, and I am back with another old Hollywood scandals video, and today we are going to talk about the scandalous thing that was Calvin Lockhart's career. We're going to get to it right after this disclaimer.
Now y'all know this disclaimer like the back of y'all hand. The whole video is hearsay, rumor, and gossip that I find on TV, online, magazine, books, and I ball it all up and I tell you guys a story. It's all for entertainment purposes only. Now let's get to it.
Burt McCloskey Cooper, aka Calvin Lockhart, was born on October the 18th, 1934 in Nassau, Bahamas. His mother's name was Minerva Cooper and his father's name was Eric Cooper. And the folks say that Calvin had at least 7 siblings, of which he was the youngest. Now, although the Coopers were deemed poor, it seems that Calvin had mostly a happy childhood. However, there were 2 things that happened during his childhood that would shape Calvin's views forever and possibly explain his behavior later on in life. Per Calvin, the first thing that shaped him was his parents instilling in him to never let a white person beat him at anything. And the second thing that happened was he and his cousin were taking a bath, and he noticed his cousin just kept scrubbing her skin over and over and over. And so Calvin is like, you're clean. Why do you keep scrubbing yourself? And his cousin told him that if she scrubbed hard enough, maybe she could become a white little girl. This, of course, made Calvin very angry, and as he grew up, these 2 episodes seemed to be the main focus of his life. Now, one thing people noticed about Calvin early on is that he was great at carpentry. And so from his early teen years, he worked as a carpenter all the way up until the age of 19 when he wanted to go to America to extend his carpentry career. So at the age of 19, Calvin took all of the money that he saved and he went over to America and he enrolled in the Cooper Union School of Engineering. But unfortunately for Calvin, life in America was not what he imagined it to be. Per Calvin, child, his life was made oh so difficult because of his pretty face. He said nobody would take him seriously, and he couldn't even walk down the streets without women pointing and giggling. And then what's worse, some of these women would even take off walking behind him, following him. Now, I am being very sarcastic and petty describing this issue, but in real life, it was said to bother Calvin Lockhart very, very much. One day while he was sitting at home, he became so upset that he grabbed a pair of scissors and allegedly started slicing himself across his face, trying to ruin his face. But even if Calvin did make any of these slices, it's pretty clear that he stopped very short before he ruined his face, because his handsomeness still shone through. And it was after this encounter that Calvin ended up getting an earful from a female cousin. Story says he was at his cousin's house and he was lamenting his beautiful looks. And the whole time, the cousin looking him upside his head like he crazy. As a matter of fact, she asked him, "Are you crazy?" When Calvin asked her what she meant, she went on to explain that many men would kill to have his look. She also told him that he should embrace his good looks, that they were God-given, and instead of hating them, he should use his good looks for something positive in life, take advantage of them. And so Calvin decided to do just that. And so he quit engineering school to start his acting career. But the roles didn't come as easy as Calvin might have hoped. And so in order to support himself, he became a construction worker and he also started driving a taxi. It was while he was driving this taxi that allegedly playwright Katie Friggs was his passenger. And per Katie Friggs, Calvin had an air of arrogance about him. But instead of pushing Katie Friggs away, she was intrigued by it. She thought Calvin was something else. She was so intrigued that she decided to cast Calvin in her new play called The Cool World, which was released in 1960. And although The Cool World died after only 2 shows, Calvin's appearance in this show, his looks, and his seriousness were the talk of the town. And soon he was cast in a play called A Taste of Honey, where he played the forbidden love interest of actress Angela Lansbury. The play was a success, but the movies were just not in the business of casting Black actors at that time. So Calvin took the smart route. He traveled abroad to seek stardom, and he found it by at first racking up a bunch of small credits on screen, and then by starring in the 1968 film Joanna. In this film, Calvin once again played one half of an interracial relationship, and his sulky moodiness just translated so well to audiences, the public overseas fell in love with him. And I'm not just talking about the women. The men were enamored with him. Later on in life, Calvin joked about the fact that he never received really one letter of hate mail for him playing a black love interest to a white woman. So this meant very clearly that Calvin Lockhart was becoming the new exotic love interest on the screen. Oh baby, he was absolutely the brand new Rudolph Valentino on the screen, except this Rudolph Valentino was black. Nobody had seen anything like it. Calvin Lockhart was all the rage. And what's even better, he was getting things done behind the scenes. He opened up a restaurant as well as an acting theater in Italy. He probably could have stayed overseas and just boom. But just like the public does now, everybody felt like the true stars were in America. The true stars were in Hollywood. And so in 1969, Calvin Lockhart decided it was time to show America who's who. And he played his cards magnificently because, baby, when that boy came back to the U.S., he was in high demand. They'd seen his success in the movie Joanna. They wanted that for their movies. Calvin Lockhart was the prime pick for black male leading role. He was quickly cast in 4 movies as soon as he arrived. One of those movies being Cotton Comes to Harlem, where Calvin played a slick, fraudulent preacher by the name of Deke O'Malley. And once American audiences got a peek at that pretty boy face, everybody started writing into magazines, writing into newspapers, saying how they loved the new actor in town and how they wanted to see more of Calvin Lockhart on the screen. This adulation and praise gave Calvin a serious boost behind the scenes. In fact, it was decided that Calvin Lockhart was to be the next breakout star. Listen to me now, y'all. Decided. Almost like a group of studio heavies came and sat down at a table and was like, okay, who's going to be the next big black Hollywood star? And somebody at the table said, oh, I know this guy, Calvin Lockhart, he should be it. Now, that may not have been exactly how it happened, but all I know is that I was told that Calvin Lockhart was poised to be the next Sidney Poitier. Calvin Lockhart was chosen to be the only black actor that was offered crossover roles in movies that were going to be seen by black audiences as well as white audiences. And one of these roles in particular was manufactured for Calvin Lockhart. It was his vehicle to break out into the mainstream for white audiences. This was going to be the one to let everybody know that Calvin Lockhart was the one. And the movie was called Halls of Anger.
And the Halls of Anger was a drama-filled role where Calvin played the principal at a high school that was all black but was now facing integration, and the white students were being integrated to the black students. So it was kind of like the flip the script thing on racism. The perfect role to lay the foundations that would lead to colorblind superstardom.
But just as quickly as this opportunity appeared, it disappeared. On his vehicle movie, The Halls of Anger, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Until this very day, people are split down the middle asking who was right or who was wrong. Let's talk about it. So the filming of the movie Halls of Anger starts out on a very upbeat, but very soon whispers start to ring out throughout all of Hollywood that there is trouble on the set. Turns out Calvin Lockhart is not who people thought he was, particularly white people. Now, the folks say that on the very first day of shooting, Calvin arrived late, then got into it with studio assistants because when he went in his dressing room, he demanded champagne, and when they tried to tell him all they had was Coca-Cola on set, Calvin told them, you may drink Coca-Cola, but I said I want champagne. They got Calvin his champagne and got on with the show. The director, Paul Bogart, thought that this late arrival and this demand for champagne, he thought that this was a one-off thing. Baby, he thought very wrong. Gossip claims that not one day while they were filming that movie did Calvin arrive on time. And then allegedly he got into an argument with the studio driver who picked him up from his home and drove him to the set. Gossip claims that once they pulled up to the studio, the limo driver was just waiting for Calvin to get out of the car. And so finally, the limo driver is like, here's your stop. You can get out. Baby said Calvin told him that I'm not getting out nowhere until you get out and come and open my door for me. Eventually, the limo driver did open Calvin's door, but after this episode, baby, he talked about Calvin like a dog, called Calvin all kind of racial slurs. As a matter of fact, he started calling him super N-word. And by the end of that movie shoot, he wouldn't be the only one calling Calvin super N-word, but we'll get to that in just a second. Gossip claims that another thing that used to annoy people on the set is that when Calvin showed up, a lot of times he showed up with a flock or a gaggle of women, all of which Calvin called his girlfriend. When Calvin brought all of these females with him, he would get in his dressing room and, just basically start entertaining like the big star he was, champagne for everybody. But you're doing this while you have a movie to shoot. People are standing outside in their positions waiting for you to come on set so they could get the shooting started. And then allegedly, if he did not bring a group or a gaggle of women with him, he had a habit of looking at the extras and he would choose the prettiest one to go on lunch with him. And then while he was gone, allegedly, he would use his stardom to get what he wanted. And he would do all of this on a lunch break. So while everybody else is back at the studio ready to shoot, Calvin is 2 hours late. And the biggest sin of them all is showing up on the set and not knowing his line. Paul Bogart, the director, was infuriated by Calvin's behavior. But not only Paul Bogart, other people on the set, not just the other actors and actresses, the set designers, the costume designers, the people that did the light, the camera crew. These people had lives. They expected to be on the studio for this amount of time, and then they expected to wrap up and go home at night. When Paul Bogart would finally say something to Calvin, Calvin would respond by saying, "You're only calling me out because I'm black. There's been several white actors to star in their own movies, and they've always been late to the set. Nobody says anything to them." And this response, of course, would elicit a "right on, brother. Yeah, you tell him, brother," from the other black actor. So they say he started riling up the rest of the black cast and the black extras to, say stuff was racist, like the female star, Tanisha. Allegedly, she was told that the white star, Pat Stitch, had a better dressing room than her. And then gossip claims that the black extras were told that the white extras were getting paid more than them, saying that the black extras were getting paid $13 a day, where the white extras were getting paid $29 a day. And so, of course, this caused all kind of resentment and complaining. And according to director Paul Bogart, every single one of these things could be explained away. Firstly, Paul Bogart said that it was an absolute lie that Pat Stitch had a better dressing room than Tanisha. He said that their dressing rooms were exactly the same. He said the only thing that Pat Stitch may have had different than Tanisha is that one segment during the movie, Pat Stitch had a makeshift dressing room on stage as well as the one off stage. And he said the only reason that she had that makeshift dressing room on stage is because in one scene of the movie, Pat Stitch's clothes are ripped off. And so because her clothes are ripped off, she needs to be able to run into a dressing room really fast and change for the next scene. And so it made sense for her to have an extra dressing room right there on the set. And then when they asked Paul Bogart about the extras and the difference in pay, he said that a lot of the black extras were just kind of kids that walked in off the street and were pretty much brand new to the movie business. Whereas those white extras were professional extras and they were SAG affiliated, meaning those white extras were a part of the Screen Actors Guild. And when you hire extras from the Screen Actors Guild, you have to pay them $29 a day because that's what the Screen Actors Guild, that's what they do for their extras. And when it was kind of thrown to him, why were the white extras part of the Screen Actors Guild and not the black extras? It basically boiled down to, before the year 1970, which is when this movie had came out, black movies were scarce, so black extras were pretty much non-existent. And because they rarely got any work, they didn't know anything about the Screen Actors Guild. And now since they knew, they couldn't just sign up for the Screen Actors Guild real quick, because when you apply for the Screen Actors Guild, you have to show a history of working in the movie business. Pretty much like you got to show credentials. But anyways, once the racial divide came, it never left. And while all of this is happening, word is just spreading continuously all around Hollywood that Halls of Anger is a disaster. There's racism on the set. There's disrespect on the set. The black actors are being treated terribly. Baby, it got so bad that the director, Paul Bogart, hated Calvin Lockhart because he felt like Calvin destroyed his movie. He was so terrified that his reputation would be ruined as being a racist and as treating these black people like dirt that he invited Life magazine to come to the set on the last day of filming so they could see for themselves. And one of the very first things that Life magazine saw when they came to the set, that Calvin Lockhart was late. The Life editor got Calvin alone and asked him straight out, why are you always late to the set? Calvin responded, listen here, baby. I've worked 8 straight months. This is my 4th major picture. Everybody wants me in their pictures. And since me being late is such a problem, maybe Hollywood just ain't for me. I live in Rome, and over there we take 2 hours for lunch. The Life editor is appalled. The Life editor says they started at 4 p.m., and then the Life editor watches as the director, Paul Bogart, tells everybody, today is the last day of filming. We're gonna be done by 6 p.m. We are wrapping up then. But Calvin started fumbling through his words. He messes up his lines so bad that by 6 o'clock, they are nowhere near done. The director, Paul Bogart, is once again furious, and he tells everybody, look, we gotta go over. So I tell you what, it's 6 o'clock. Everybody needs to break for dinner. Everybody needs to be back at 7 p.m. 7 p.m., no Calvin Lockhart. 7:15, no Calvin Lockhart. 7:30, no Calvin Lockhart. 8 o'clock is when Calvin Lockhart was said to come strolling through the door. The director don't even fuss. He just says action. Calvin starts messing up his lines again. This time the director, Paul Bogart, explodes. He comes up to Calvin's face and accuses him of not knowing your lines. Calvin says, I do know my lines. I just keep messing up because that bit player over there, she keeps extending her lines. She's ad-libbing too much and she's throwing me off. The director yells and tells Calvin, that is ridiculous. Stop blaming other people. You don't know your lines. You just don't know them. It's your fault. All of this has been your fault, Calvin. Guess what Calvin did, y'all? Very, very cool and smooth, leaned back and told the director, I can't work under these circumstances with you talking like this to me, and took off walking to his dressing room. Allegedly, the director was behind him hopping mad, screaming, just don't come back. Don't come back. Stay in your trailer. We're going to film it without you. And when the Life editor asks, how are you going to film this without the star? The director basically tells him, we've been doing it the whole time. We've been filming around him the whole time, so I'll just keep doing that. And the director, Paul Bogart, was so enraged by what happened to his movie. He said not only would he never work with Calvin Lockhart again, he would never talk to Calvin Lockhart again. And when he was asked, what about the rumor that Calvin Lockhart is doing this for his fellow black actors, for his fellow black people? Paul Bogart responded by saying, Calvin Lockhart is full of ish. He does all this talk about black people, he cares about them, his black brothers. But if he truly cared about his black brothers, he would have never left his black brothers that played the extras outside burning up in the hot sun while he took an extra hour for lunch. Especially when he rode through the crowd of them in his big fat Cadillac with all his AC. He didn't care about his brothers then. I know I've said it many times, but it was just a mess. You know what I'm saying? It was just a disaster. And also, I have left the link to Life magazine, to the article for you guys to go read it yourself. It's very interesting because not only does it talk about Calvin Lockhart and the director Paul Bogart, he also interviewed some of those other black actors. And a lot of them talked about what they perceived as racist behavior. Even some of those rumors that were alleged to be egged on by Calvin Lockhart, like the extras being paid wrong and the dressing room thing. Anyway, when you read that article for yourself, you probably can make up your own mind about who you think was right and was wrong. But I'll tell you right now, back in the day, most black people, especially black people who were just simply a part of the public, they sided with Calvin. They felt like this man had been put through the ringer by those white folk. But regardless of what they felt, it was those white folks that dominated Hollywood. And they made up their minds that Calvin Lockhart was a pompous, whiny, hard to work with black man with a chip on his shoulder. He was labeled difficult, and that ticket they offered him as a surefire way to colorblind stardom, baby, they snatched that thing away faster than a Houdini magic trick. Soon after this terrible episode of what many felt like was self-destruction for Calvin Lockhart, you started to see the shift in Hollywood against him. Other episodes of his alleged nastiness started to pop up, like an interview he did with the Chicago newspaper where the interviewer had just gotten a surgery to remove a cyst from her forehead. Well, allegedly, the whole time during the interview, Calvin was just kind of staring at her forehead, just looking, and then just blurted out in the middle of nowhere, "What's that thing on your forehead?" And then there was another interview where Calvin was explaining his side of what happened in Halls of Anger. And the interviewer said that she almost walked out because allegedly Calvin kind of snapped at her because she was not writing down his every word. And also she was another one that said that, his arrogance was just too much. I'm going to leave the link to this interview in the description. You guys can read that along with the Life article. And again, make up your own mind. Do you think Calvin was being difficult, or do you think all of this stuff was just things to slander Calvin with? Out of all of this stuff that was happening, though, at that point in time, none of it seemed to matter to Calvin Lockhart. He felt that he was already a star. Who could do without his handsome face? And he was such a good actor, Hollywood needed him. And you can tell that he believed this with all of his heart. He thought that he would remain on top of the world. In that interview I just mentioned from above, he even fixed his mouth to say something negative towards Sidney Poitier. Pause the screen to check it out. Sidney Poitier, are you kidding me? This man was Hollywood royalty by this point, and you dare criticize him to the public? Again, Calvin felt comfortable because he felt like his star was here to stay. And when the British public voted him the sexiest man alive in the year 1971, this confirmed to Calvin that he was here to stay. But he was about to find out that although he thought he wasn't going nowhere, baby, he was definitely finna go somewhere. Whereas he filmed 4 movies in the year 1970, he didn't have a single one in 1971. All of those cream of the crop roles that had been offered to him, every single one of those roles were rescinded. No matter how much he tried to deny it, no matter how much he tried to fight it. It became inherently clear that the big Hollywood players were over him and there was just no room for him anymore. The only place left for Calvin to go was Black Hollywood. And lucky for him, Black Hollywood was just getting started with their new genre, BLAXPLOITATIon. But if Calvin thought, I'm just gonna stroll on over here to the black side and snatch up all these roles, baby, he had another thing coming. It actually was a fight to get Calvin Lockhart in his first BLAXPLOITATIon role. That role was in a movie named Melinda. And the director of that movie, a black man by the name of Hugh Robertson, had to go to war with MGM just to be allowed to cast Calvin Lockhart. MGM kept telling Hugh Robertson, no, we don't want Calvin Lockhart. And finally, Hugh Robertson had to tell them, well, if I can't get Calvin, I'm not doing the movie. So finally, MGM was like, fine, you can have Calvin Lockhart, but we ain't got no money to pay him. Ain't no money in the budget. And so Hugh scraped up whatever money he could, and he went to Calvin and he told him, they're saying that I can't pay you much, so I don't have much to pay you, but I still want you to have the movie role. And Calvin had no choice but to accept this. He had no other work going for himself. And you can tell that Calvin put his heart in this role. He did really well. He and Vanetta McGee were beautiful across that screen. So that was 1972, and then after that, nothing. The rest of 1972 and the whole year of 1973, Calvin Lockhart had not one film again in the United States. He did go over close to his homeland to start filming movies there, and he also was able to get a role in the British movie All Beasts Must Die. But this was a horror movie, and it certainly was not a movie that one would think of when they would think of a big star. Calvin was at a loss. But there was one person in America who tried to save the day, and that was Sidney Poitier. He cast Calvin in his new movie, Uptown on a Saturday Night, in which Calvin played a gangster called Silky Slim. And it's very ironic because just a few years before, Calvin Lockhart was making snarky comments about Sidney Poitier. But now Sidney Poitier was pretty much the only one in his corner. In fact, the streets say that Sidney Poitier did indeed have a soft spot for for Calvin Lockhart because they were both from the Bahamas, and Sidney wanted to help his Bahamian brother salvage what little bit was left of his career, which is why he had Calvin Lockhart appear in his next project. And this was the 1975 movie Let's Do It Again. And Calvin Lockhart stamped his mark on this movie. He played the smooth but dangerous gangster Biggie Smalls. This role would define Calvin Lockhart. This would be the role that he would become most known for. And it was this appearance as Biggie Smalls that kind of jolted American audiences away. Many of them started to notice that something weird was going on with Calvin Lockhart's career. It was going in reverse. For anybody else, the role of Biggie Smalls would have launched them to stardom, or at least it would have put them on a launching pad to star in their own movie where they were the main character. But what they didn't know is Calvin had already had his chance as the leading man. He'd already had his chance at superstardom. And Biggie Smalls, although it was a magnificent part, was actually for Calvin the opposite of getting a bigger role. It was the start of Calvin becoming less and less of a main character and more of a side character. But why was this? Why was Calvin Lockhart, being the talent that he was, not getting work lined up back to back to back? And I'm not talking about that whole episode that happened with the white side of Hollywood, the mainstream movie. I'm talking about here on the black side of Hollywood. Why wasn't Calvin Lockhart getting role after role? Because outside of the two movies that Sidney put him in, he only starred in one more American movie in 1974, and that movie was called Honey Baby, which was a flop. This is while Jim Kelly, Fred Williamson, heck, even Isaac Hayes are soaring around this time. Why not Calvin Lockhart? Now, we absolutely already know that Calvin Lockhart was blackballed, but even through blackballing, black directors could have worked Calvin Lockhart into their movies if they wanted to, just like Hugh Robertson did, the director of Melinda. Why was nobody doing that for him? I'll tell you why. Because allegedly Calvin Lockhart was held behind the scenes. Just like on Halls of Anger, allegedly you couldn't tell Calvin nothing. He was not teachable. He was demanding. Luckily for Calvin, though, he lived in a time period where black people were not calling each other out. In the 1970s and before, blacks closed ranks around their own. They would have never came out to the media saying, boy, that Calvin Lockhart, he's just too much. No way. They were going to put a smile on their face and say that Calvin was just wonderful. He was simply amazing, all the while under their breath saying, boy, I never work with that Negro again. Ossie Davis was one who was rumored to have done this. After it got out to the public about the way Calvin Lockhart was acting on the set of Halls of Anger, a lot of media sources went to Ossie because Ossie produced Cotton Comes to Harlem. And so people wanted to know, was Calvin Lockhart acting like this on the set of your movie too? Or is it just this Halls of Anger movie? And Ossie did not answer these people directly, but he sent a message through his wife, Ruby, that said, I'm very pleased to work with Calvin. Now, Calvin is a very conscientious man, but he brought a lot to the film set. Clearly, Ossie wanted to say a lot more about this very conscientious man, but he wasn't going to do that. He just wasn't going to speak on another brother like that. But I tell you one thing, Ossie Davis never cast Calvin Lockhart in another one of his projects. And that is how a lot of black directors and black actors dealt with Calvin Lockhart. They didn't speak negatively about him in the public. They just wouldn't give him the work. And because they wouldn't give him the work, Calvin Lockhart's movie roles, even as a side character, became very skippy-headed. The rest of 1975, 1976, and 1977, Calvin went back over to his native country, and I think he did maybe one or two movies there. But he just kept thinking about the star that he was supposed to have been. So he came back to the United States once again. And this was in 1978. But by this time, BLAXPLOITATION was coming to an end. He did find work in TV, though. He played the character Alan in some of the episodes of Starsky and Hutch. Then he played Florida's cousin Raymond in Good Times for maybe one or two episodes. Not only was life not going well in front of the camera, behind the camera, life was going even worse. Turns out, back in 1970, when Calvin had that flock or gaggle of girlfriends on the set with him, he was a very married man. His wife at the time was said to be a lady from Bahamas, but when she came to the U.S., she settled in Massachusetts. I could not find the name of this wife, Lord knows I tried, but with her he had 2 two sons, a son named Michael and a son named Leslie. And Calvin admitted to leaving his wife and children to be a star. In fact, he said that he did not reconnect with his sons until they were near grown. And it was said to be a tragedy that caused this reconnection. You see, Michael and Leslie both grew up and went into acting just like their father. And from the looks of this article, Calvin was hesitant to let his sons go into acting. Pause to read it. And can you believe that Calvin put his reason as being his sons might get the big head? Sir, you would know. But on top of this big head reason, there may have been another reason that Calvin was hesitant for his sons to act. Probably because he knew it's not always easy to become a big star, and allegedly his sons found out the hard way. Both Michael and Leslie failed in their attempt for stardom, and allegedly both of his sons went through a deep depression. Michael was said to have completely distanced himself from his family, and Leslie's depression led him to hang with the wrong crowd. And it was while he was with this crowd that in the year 1978 or 1979, Leslie was smoking a joint, but what he didn't know is that somebody had laced the joint with angel dust. After a few puffs, Leslie started to hear voices, with one of the voices telling him, "Man, you gotta get out of here, man. Right now, you gotta jump out the window, man. You gotta get out of here." Which is what Leslie did. But Leslie was on the 5th floor of the building that he was in. Baby, them folks say Leslie came crashing down through that window. People didn't know what to do. And Leslie, still in his very high state, positioned himself to land on his feet. As soon as he hit the ground, all the bones in his feet were shattered. Even some of the bones in his legs were cracked. The injuries were so bad that Leslie would never walk again. Calvin was said to have felt so guilty about what happened to his son because he blamed himself, because he felt like it was because he was not in his son's life that his son had turned to drugs and this happened. But after this, Calvin vowed to make it right. He picked up his son and moved his son to Hollywood with him, and not only that, he became a spokesperson against drug use. Now, that was the children that Calvin had with his first wife. Calvin married a second time in the year 1972 to a Jamaican model named Thelma Walter. But throughout the marriage, Calvin was said to have started drinking because he was depressed about his career. And also he was said to have cheated constantly. So he and Thelma divorced in 1978. His next marriage was to a woman that truly showed Calvin real love. She was a businesswoman and her name was Lynn Sloan. And Calvin said that marrying Lynn was the best role he ever played in his life. He said that she was the first woman that showed him what it meant to truly love and respect himself. Baby, Calvin was so enraptured with Lynn that when a tourist asked for an autograph on their wedding day, Calvin went off, baby, and demanded that the tourist apologize to his wife, Lynn. How dare he try to ruin their sacred day by asking such a request? And baby, when I read the response from the tourist, honey, I fell out. Because while Calvin is all puffed up and how dare you and you need to apologize, the tourist is sitting up there like, I just asked for an autograph. Child, that tourist was gonna learn today, you don't ask Calvin nothing with his new wife Lynn around. No matter how much Calvin ranted and raved about his new wife Lynn, somebody allegedly in the know left comments on a gossip blog about how Calvin started busting Lynn all upside the head. And it said in the year of 1987, Lynn disappeared in the middle of the night, and according to some of the messy folks on the gossip blog, she took a right good amount of Calvin's money with her. Allegedly. I will say that it's kind of funny how the records show that Calvin Lockhart met his last wife, a lady by the name of Jennifer Miles. Allegedly, he met her in the year 1979, 2 years before he married businesswoman Lynn Sloan. And it's also funny how the records show that Calvin had a baby with Jennifer Miles, a son named Julian, born in the year 1981. 1 year before he married businesswoman Lynn Sloan. So how do you explain that? I don't know. Maybe Calvin was set to marry Jennifer and Jennifer didn't want to marry Calvin, so he moved on to businesswoman Lynn Sloan. I don't know. All I know is that even after Calvin divorced Lynn Sloan, he and Jennifer Miles were still connected. As a matter of fact, gossip claims that they were off and on all the way up until the year 2006, which is when they finally married. To get back to the career side of things, the year 1980 came around, and Calvin looked at the year 1980 as his comeback. He even did a comeback interview detailing things that happened in his life, and he also admitted in this interview just how difficult he'd been in the past when it came to show business. He basically said that at that time, he thought the Hollywood fantasy was his life. And he said a lot more, but to put it in layman's terms for you guys, Calvin basically said that he thought that Hollywood would humor him while he acted like a big star. He felt like his talent would let him get away with these things, but he learned very quickly that Hollywood does not play that. And I'll also put a link to this interview in the description. And once you guys read it, you'll see the difference in Calvin. The way he behaved in that first interview where he was all snarky and the way he behaved in this interview, he certainly showed a lot more humility. Although 1980 was supposed to be Calvin's comeback year, he only appeared in one movie that year. He might have done a couple of stage plays, but that was it. Calvin did not show back up on anybody's movie screen until the year 1988. But unfortunately, by this time, Calvin wasn't even playing side characters anymore. His roles had been reduced to bit parts, like his appearance in Coming to America, where he played Vanessa Bell Calloway's father, or his appearance in the movie Predator 2. In TV, he may have had a little bit more luck. I mean, he appeared on 7 episodes of Dynasty, where he played Dominique Devereaux's boyfriend. But his acting career was, and think about that, like really think about that. That is absolutely devastating and really just a little bit amazing that this man's career had fallen that much. A man who was 10 years before poised to take over the world. He was primed to be Denzel Washington before Denzel Washington. And if you believe the rumors, he blew it. Even Paul Mooney did an interview and talked about how Calvin Lockhart's career ended before it even got started because of his arrogance. And at this point, it's not even a matter of if he was right or if he was wrong for what he did. It's just the fact that he did it. Maybe he was right for his behavior on the movie Halls of Anger. Maybe he was right on the way he behaved on all of the rest of those movie sets in the 70s. Who knows? Maybe Calvin had a point. But whether he was right or wrong, the fact of the matter comes down to the fact that it was Calvin's doing. It was his actions that ruined his career. His story is very much similar to the story of Nina Simone. And for both of them, that was a terrible revelation to live with. Throughout this terrible awful, though, I do believe that Calvin's homeland of the Bahamas did recognize him as a huge actor, and I'm pretty sure they gave him the star treatment that a huge star deserved. He also did a lot of work with the theatrical talent over in the Bahamas, and it's even said that he produced a few movies. Calvin Lockhart's last known film role was in a movie called Rain, and this movie was released in 2008, which was 1 year after Calvin passed away. And Calvin passed away on March 29, 2007 from the complications of a stroke. Rumor has it he was surrounded by his beautiful last wife, Jennifer Miles, and their son, Julian. And at the time of his death, Calvin Lockhart was 72 years old. And this last bit of tea alleges that Calvin Lockhart is the reason that Big Papa, aka Biggie Smalls, aka Christopher Wallace, stopped using the name Biggie Smalls. Because allegedly Calvin and some others who starred in the movie with him was suing Christopher Wallace to tell him to stop using this as his rap name. And if it is true, to me, that's definitely a little bit of pettiness going on. But you know, hey, maybe Calvin had a big reason to why he wanted to sue. I don't know. Whatever the case, we are finally at the end of the Old Hollywood Scandals video for Mr. Calvin Lockhart. I hope you guys enjoyed hearing this story just as much as I enjoyed telling this story, because I really did. I feel like this is a fantastic story. Anyways, you guys, I don't ever ask this, but share. That's what I want y'all to do. Share the video, like, and comment. Share, like, and comment. If you guys are new here, please subscribe. If you guys have been sitting and watching, just riding the fence, go ahead and subscribe. It ain't hurting y'all. I love y'all so much. About to get started on another video. Love y'all. Bye.